Seja toda a gente bem-vindo ao É Apenas Fumaça, um programa Fumaça onde se fala sobre a sociedade com quem quer falar sobre ela. Eu sou o Ricardo Esteves Ribeiro. Hoje lançamos uma entrevista gravada em Estrasburgo, onde estivemos a convite do Parlamento Europeu. Falamos sobre refugiados e sobre a fortaleza que a União Europeia parece ter criado à sua volta. Este foi um dos temas mais votados, quando há cerca de um mês vos perguntámos o que devíamos cobrir até às eleições europeias do próximo maio. É por isso também que vou estar durante o próximo mês a fazer uma investigação exatamente sobre este tema, a lançar no início de maio. Subscrevam em fumaca.pt/subscrever para a receber quando ela sair. Fiz várias entrevistas sobre o tema com eurodeputados portugueses e estrangeiros. Uma delas foi com Claude Moraes, eurodeputado britânico do Partido Trabalhista, eleito pela primeira vez em 1999 e presidente da Comissão das Liberdades Cívicas, da Justiça e dos Assuntos Internos desde 2014. Entrevistei no dia 28 de março, horas depois da maioria dos deputados britânicos da Câmara dos Comuns ter chumbado as 8 propostas alternativas ao acordo do Brexit que Theresa May negociou com a União Europeia. Fiquem com a entrevista.
So, according to the NGO Transnational Institutes, countries from the EU or the Schengen area built around 1,000 kilometers of walls, so around 620 miles, since the 90s to prevent immigrants to arrive Europe or to limit transit inside Europe. The total length of these walls is 6 times the Berlin Wall and equals 1/3 of the United States-Mexico wall that Donald Trump wants to complete. Are we building a Europe fortress?
I think the concept of a European fortress has always existed. The European Union is essentially, particularly Western Europe, your country, Portugal, my country, the United Kingdom, have an imperialistic colonial past. And Europe in its modern form can kid itself that somehow it is special, but it has always had, as far as the timeline of the European Union is concerned, from 1979 onwards, had a paradoxical situation. On the one hand, it has wanted to see itself as open kind of Europe, but it always, despite in the early days the European Commission being very progressive on migration, it has always had its member states concerned about the external border. So building a kind of, you can call it fortress, but you can certainly say building an external border, because it had that tension and concern that you had a Schengen area. So you had the potential of free movement, so there had to be this external border. And the right would always want that border to be strong and to be like a fortress. More progressive forces in the European Union would always want that to be not a fortress, but for us to be more open. So that tension has always existed, and you're quite right to say that today we're in a phase where that kind of fortress, you see it with the European Border Guard proposal, you see it with member states taking more control of the agenda with Salvini and so on, more of a tendency towards that. So the way I would see it is there is a tension, a political tension between people who want to see a more open Europe, more progressive people, and people who want to see a more closed Europe, a more fortress Europe. But the issue is, I think, we're more moving towards member states taking control of that agenda.
You mean the agenda of building walls, you say?
Yes, definitely. I think that's a global Western movement, populist movement. Not to say populism doesn't exist in other countries. Of course, you see that also in so-called BRIC countries or developing countries. But for Western countries, there is now a populist movement. You have Trump, you have a populism seeping into European politics. And of course, that will see its way into migration.
But it seems like we don't talk as much about those walls as we talk about Trump's wall.
Yeah, there's a reason for that. First of all, you have Trump. He's very easy to identify. And you had a United States which is built on migration. The green card, very much that was its popular notion. Suddenly you have a white supremacist actor, president coming in, using all the tropes of white supremacy, a very kind of deceitful type of character, trying to inflame his white base. And that's very easy to identify, it's very easy to report. In the European Union, what you have is a very complex political situation. You have many progressives. You have a European Commission and European institutions which began the journey on migration as a very progressive journey, wanting a Europe to be open, to be inclusive in many ways. So it is more complicated, and that's why the fortress element is not as easy to explain and identify. However, in the past weeks, months, it is becoming more clear, and how it's becoming more clear is not through a Trump as such, but it's becoming more clear through the Salvinis, through the Orbans, and also through weakening institutions. So the Commission not being able to stand up to that, to weaker member states not really asserting themselves, meaning the big ones. So obviously Britain now leaving, but France, Germany not standing up to that enough. Although I do think they stand up, but there are good member states, Sweden, what Germany has done recently, and there is no way of throwing that out, because Germany did a good thing during the migration crisis. So when you ask the question, why is it less visible? It's less visible because it is genuinely more complicated. So for example, when you have a proposal here on the European Border and Coast Guard, there are many people who want to limit that. There are many people who want to make that more progressive, because the European Union is not just one politics. There are many political persuasions, many political groups. There's a left, right and centre here. And within, say, for your country, Portugal, all of those political groups are represented. And so that has to be understood too.
According to Transnational Institute, so the same NGO I was quoting before, a total of 13 walls were built by state members of the EU or Schengen area. Countries like Spain, Greece, Bulgaria,
Yes,
Austria, Slovenia, United Kingdom, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Norway, and also Hungary, obviously. And Hungary was responsible for half of those 1,000 kilometers, with basically the barrier that was built between Hungary and Serbia, Hungary and Croatia in 2015 during the big migrant crisis or refugee crisis, in order to stop the flow of immigrant and refugees passing through the country. What impact did this move have in the lives of refugees during 2015 and 2016 mainly?
I think they've had a big impact very practically on families who have been affected on those borders. But I think the bigger impact is where the publicity hasn't been. So you mentioned Spain, you mentioned some of the different countries who have built fencing walls, United Kingdom another example, France, Calais, all of these kind of not necessarily connected but deterrent measures that have happened.
And can you explain an example, like what actually happened? What does it mean to actually build a fence wall?
Well,
not the Hungary one.
You see, I know you're creating a theme about fences and walls, but the issue is that populists want tropes of walls to happen. So they want journalists to, that's what they want. That's their holy grail. They want a journalist to say the West is building walls. What's happening in the European Union, I don't think is quite the same as what Trump is doing. He's saying he wants to build a wall. That's it. I think what's happening in the European Union is it's much more complicated, because I think you've got different layers of events happening. So, but it's happening. And it's happening now in the sense of it's happening in a more controlled direction. So when you say what's happening, so the institutions, I mentioned the European Border and Coast Guard proposal.
So let's talk about that. So in 2016, in July, there was a new regulation coming to the European Parliament for voting, basically giving more control and more power to Frontex, the European Border and Coast Guard Agency. It basically changed the name too, giving it more power, more budget to. The regulation passed with 483 votes in favor, 181 against, 48 abstentions. Was this a good deal?
I mean, I'm personally opposed to the European Border and Coast Guard being strengthened. So, for example, the current proposal, our group has a red line on... What was the thing? Yeah, so we established a red line yesterday, certainly within our group, on returns from third countries. So within these proposals, we fight for...
But in 2016, was this a good deal?
I don't think so, no.
But you voted for it.
Yeah, I mean, issues about voting for a final proposal once we've amended it. So we tried to amend it and voted for the final proposal. But yeah, I mean, I'm not happy with it. I'm not happy with the final proposal.
So why did you vote for it?
Well, sometimes you vote for some things that you don't particularly like. So that happens sometimes in politics. So in the end, we voted for it, yes.
But what was the reason behind it?
Because the thing is, you sometimes have to have a balance. Like, for example, we want the Dublin reform. We want reform and asylum package.
We'll be talking about that.
Yeah, so we want a balanced proposal. So this should have been part of a balanced proposal. And you're quite right. We didn't get the other half of the deal. We should have had a whole asylum package. We should have had, return on the control side. There should have been returns and Frontex, which is coming more from the right. But we should have had Dublin responsibility sharing. We should have had resettlement, which is, of course, coming from the progressive and left. We should have had a whole range of measures, which you've seen in the asylum package, probably about 12 or 13 files, all of which have now been frozen. So I think the idea was, I mean, I'm being completely honest with you because you asked the correct question, is why would any progressive vote for any more restrictive policy? And the reason is, if anyone ever votes for, I mean, I'm an immigrant, I've experienced deportation removal. Why would you vote for something like Frontex? Essentially, there have to be borders. I mean, you can argue you shouldn't have borders. I don't argue that. Every country needs borders. The European Union needs an external border. But not if there aren't counterbalancing measures, not if you're not going to have ways for refugees to become refugees in the European Union, claim in a decent way, be rescued. Now, it is true that what is happening now in the European Union is the emphasis on those measures is going. The freezing of the asylum package is a really good example of that. And it's definitely the case that if I were to go back in 2016 and know now what is happening on the asylum package, I may have voted differently on this. So it's a very good question you ask. Mm-hmm. And now on the current Frontex proposal, the current European Border Coast Guard proposal.
You mean the one yesterday?
The one yesterday. Yeah, so now we are taking a very different attitude to that. Mm-hmm. We are learning a lesson. And I think it's a good question you ask. Mm-hmm. And in politics, you do learn those lessons. And I think I'd be right in saying our group, and our entire group, not just me, is looking at it in a very much tougher way.
I've interviewed this week the Portuguese MEP Marisa Matias from the European United Left, Nordic Green Left. She calls this, piece of regulation of 2016 about the Frontex a racist and xenophobic regulation, and calls Frontex a deportation agency. Do you agree with that today?
Yeah, I mean, people can have their labels for things, and I think when you're in a particular group, you can have a label for things. I mean, it's up to you what you want to call it. I mean, Frontex does what it does, and people can sloganize. I don't go in for sloganizing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's just an easy way out. So you're a journalist. It's good for you to be able to report that and then say to me, do you agree? I mean, what I think is more important is scrutinizing or dealing with what Frontex does and doesn't do. For example, if you say that, are you taking account of what Frontex did with its rescue operations? So, for example, during the period in the Mediterranean when not many people were rescuing anyone, and Frontex and a few, Italian naval ships were the only people rescuing human beings from the sea. And I'm an immigrant, and I know, like I say, I've been deported. I would never have experienced that, but I can feel that when there were only those people doing it. So you can't have a blanket statement, because there'll be people in those agencies who have done the right thing. Mm-hmm. Of course, the proposal must be criticised, and I've done that. So she's right to be critical of the thing, but I think just a general slogan, I'm not sure. It's just my opinion. Mm-hmm. I mean, she's of course free to use her slogan, but I think putting words in other people's mouths, generally speaking, no.
Since 2017, multiple NGOs responsible for the rescue of thousands of refugees in the Mediterranean Sea started being legally prosecuted by multiple member states, leading sometimes to confiscating their vessels and to stopping their rescue missions. This happens to Doctor Without Borders, Sea-Watch, Jugendrettet in 2017. Actually now, 10 of its members are being charged with aid to illegal immigration by the Italian judiciary.
Yeah.
Is this a European strategy, stopping activists from rescuing people in the Mediterranean Sea?
Yes, it's a strategy. It's a deterrent strategy, which we're very opposed to. We met with the NGOs, what was it, last week?
A number of times.
Yeah, many times. The latest being last week. We met with MSF, Sea-Watch.
MSF being the Doctors Without Borders.
Yeah, and some of the key NGOs who are currently in the Mediterranean. And I mean, I'm very much of the opinion, and I mean, we've been active in this, I've personally been active in this, that what is happening now is that the member states are driving a policy of criminalising NGOs to send a message. They're using these events driven by, member states, and Salvini is a good example, and it's ending with what you see in the last couple of days, where Operation Sophia, where the ships were removed from it. And I have no doubt that it is part of a strategy driven by the member states.
Not European Union.
Well, let me explain this, right? Because we can be simplistic. I'll explain exactly what is happening. The member states are driving it. Why do you say the member states are driving it? They're driving it because they're doing it in the face of a weakened Commission. So the European Commission is very much going along with it. It's sometimes facilitating it. This is a consequence of member states asserting themselves more and more on migration. It's a consequence of member states who have more right-wing governments, who have populist governments seizing control of the agenda. They then put pressure on the European Commission. They then ignore what the European Parliament is doing. So the colleague that you mentioned from GUE, they can say what they want here, support the asylum package. In fact, I would probably be supporting the asylum package in the same way that the colleague that you mentioned from Portugal. And
Marisa Matias.
Yeah, and we'll be voting the same way on the asylum package and all the rest of it. But
What does that mean?
What it means is on more progressive policies, right? But what is now happening is the member states are forcing us into a position where they have literally shelving or freezing all of that. I mean, they've not literally destroyed the asylum package yet, which is quite interesting, but they're shelving it all.
But what is that package? What does that actually
So
mean?
it's a whole set of measures which would create a decent sort of holistic asylum process. So you can apply for asylum, there are legal routes, there are reception conditions, there's a responsibility sharing incumbent on all member states, there's a resettlement policy, so you're taking people out of danger zones, and that's legally enforceable. Without that, what you're doing is you're ceding to member states control when the populist member states are driving the issue. So you've got people like Salvini and others pushing the envelope. The other thing is that you're talking about the criminalisation, which I'll just get back to this because this is really important. What is happening in this kind of vacuum where the member states are pushing the envelope is that you talked about the European Union, with the External Action Service, what they are doing is they are making an example of this. And in the last 2 or 3 days, Operation Sophia, which I would have expected should never be touched, is now losing its vessels. This means people will drown, people will die, more people will.
Well, actually, there was this report called Desperate Journeys from the United Nations in September last year that showed that although the number of people arriving in Europe and crossing the Mediterranean significantly dropped, the cross became deadlier than ever.
Yes,
quoting the UN's
correct.
press release, the report shows that while the total number of people arriving in Europe has fallen, the rate of deaths has risen sharply, particularly for those crossing via Mediterranean Sea. in the central Mediterranean, one person died or went missing for every 18 people who crossed Europe between January and July, compared to one death in every 42 people crossed the same period in 2017.
Yeah, that's right. So although the numbers are falling, and it's wrong that people use the fact that numbers are falling because the crossings are getting more dangerous, the deterrent methods being used are more dangerous. I mean, I've been involved in immigration policy for most of my adult life. I was director of an NGO, legal protection NGO for immigrants and asylum seekers before I became a member. I know that one of the biggest weapons that Western countries use on immigration and asylum is deterrence. It's making an example of people. And I think what is happening in the Mediterranean is those NGOs who are criminalised are then sent as like an example. And I think now, I mean, what we've done here, personally, we've pushed the facilitation directive, which is to make the Commission have guidelines that don't allow individual member states to criminalise NGOs. And we've worked with NGOs to do that. But of course, what I see happening here is that member states are forcing us into this populist phase and the member states who are not populist don't seem to be holding this back, and that's a worry at the moment.
But given this, should the European Union, or particularly these member states, be investigated for crimes against humanity?
Well, I think we did discuss. I mean, the last meeting with NGOs, which we set up, we had really strong legal opinions. We had international lawyers with us, and I think this is something that, you know, I'm glad that you're looking into it. But we need to look at the international law in this, because one of the things that was made very clear at this meeting, and then I did another meeting that day, again with NGOs, that people will look back on this period and people will ask, like, where they were during this period of mass deaths in the Mediterranean, but not just there, by the way, but also in the Sahara. I mean, I was in Libya and the routes in Agadez and Niger, where I think, I mean, I don't have the evidence, but I would suspect the numbers are higher in terms of deaths than in the Mediterranean. People will ask where all of us were during this period. And for this reason, I think international law or international lawyers have to now say what culpability member states have, what culpability institutions have, because people are dying. And I think the key thing that you said that was correct was that they're using the idea that numbers are falling, but the routes are becoming more dangerous because this is a dismantling of the rescue efforts.
Although Frontex has more power.
Frontex has power, but I would say, again, if I can add value to this interview, what you're doing now, is that Frontex in the end is not that big an agency. You know, people look at some of these agencies in the EU. Frontex isn't that big. The Mediterranean is a big place. You know, it may sound kind of obvious, but when you go on the Agadez Niger route or you go to the Mediterranean, it may look smaller on the map, but it's big. So people are dying that we never see, that the media never spots. The reason that the biggest number of deaths are in Africa, Niger and Agadez, is journalists don't want to go there. It's too difficult for them, so they won't go. And they won't go to Libya. It's too difficult for them. So that means that the reporting that they get secondhand for the Mediterranean, from the stats from the ships that are there, the agencies that are there, is what they report on. So I think what needs to happen, and you're implying it now, is we need to look at the real international legal order here, and criminalisation is one thing of NGOs, but that's one thing. I mean, what is happening now with Operation Sophia? I mean, what is the legality of this when people are dying?
Can you explain what Operation Sophia is?
Operation Sophia was the EU-based operation, using even military assets, but in some way from different countries. And it really worries me now that as part of this, I think you rightly pointed out, this kind of movement towards, you know, criminalising NGOs and so on, this deterrent effect, that suddenly they've had their assets removed, like ships removed. I think that's a direct effect of populism. That's Italian government pressure. This is not coming from the institutions. We didn't vote for this here. So there's a lack of accountability also. What should happen here is that member states who are not run by populist governments need to stand up. Of course, the Parliament needs to stand up as well. I tweeted today about the Operation Sophia. My tweet could not be clearer. It's saying, the institutions, country, we are culpable for what is going to happen. I could not be clearer. And I'm chair of our committee. Now, okay, we need to shout louder, but I also believe, not you because you're a good investigative journalist, but I think the media as a whole, there's also like a media fatigue about the Mediterranean. I'm sure you've seen that amongst the so-called mainstream media. So it's a vicious circle at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Another deal that was not voted by the European Parliament was in 2015, the EU-Turkey deal. I'm not sure the European Union actually calls that a deal. It's like a press release, I would say. On 18th of March, so 3 years ago last week, they agreed on a deal that, in the words of Angela Merkel, on that day, on the day of the signature, she would say, and I quote, to help above all those most directly affected, the refugees. So summing up the deal, all irregular, quote-unquote irregular migrants crossing from Turkey to Greece would be sent back to Turkey. From each Syrian refugee when going to Turkey, one would come to Europe on a cap of 72,000 people. Turkey would commit to preventing people coming to Europe, and then in return, Europe would accelerate the fulfillment of visa liberalization for Turkish citizens, would pay $6 billion in the course of 3 to 4 years, and then would also review the Turkish admission to the European Union. Was this outsourcing a problem to the other side of the continent?
Yes. Simply it was. It was an outsourcing thing. It was the EU-Turkey deal was a solution sought by the European Union primarily to the Syrian crisis. And it was, in some ways, I visited the refugee camps in Turkey. If you visit refugee camps in Lesbos in Greece, or you visit some camps as I have in Africa, the camps in Turkey are some of the best organised, most humanitarian camps there are. But the Turkey deal itself is deeply flawed because, as you said, what was the raison d'etre of it? What was the purpose? It was to find a solution for Europe. And it comes back to the point of what is the European Union's purpose? The European Union's purpose is to try and manage a refugee crisis. Now, the vast majority of refugees don't come to the European Union. They go to other places. But you're European. I'm maybe slightly less European. The fact is, that's what Europeans majority seem to want. They wanted a solution. And this was the deeply flawed solution that was found. And as we've seen, because of the change in government and all of the trade-offs, it has been, and during that whole period, we were very, very compromised and very, what would be the word? I think very troubled by the whole process. So the entire period was very difficult because we were, on the one hand, being told that you need a solution to this daily, point the EU is doing nothing about the refugee crisis, by countries that wanted a solution, and that includes Greece, that includes Italy, that includes all the countries of the EU. Portugal as well, everyone wanted a solution. And but we knew that the EU-Turkey deal has deep flaws, including human rights flaws.
But if you go to the Socialists and Democrats website, to the press area, on the 7th of March 2016, there's a press release that reads, Labour MEPs, EU-Turkey migration agreement is welcome, but Ankara must do more to allay concerns. So you welcomed the deal at that point.
We didn't welcome it. We said there were concerns. That's just.
It's the website. It's the Socialists and Democrats website.
So the second bit was there were concerns. I don't call that a welcome. That's just.
It was a title. It was not a title of an outlet, a press outlet. It was a press release.
Yeah,
title.
Because the main groups accepted in the end the EU-Turkey deal, but nobody liked it. That's the point I'm trying to make. So
you said it was not the main. It couldn't be the main solution, right?
No, I explained it was an outsourcing that no progressive could like that. nobody could like it. Because it had so many flaws to it. And I hated the EU-Turkey deal. I still don't like it. But I'm explaining why the main groups, in the end, went for it. And I'm trying to explain that. That press release classically says it. It says there's a lot of concerns. And then it says what the concerns are. So you kind of said it yourself.
I know it says it was concerns, but it also says that you welcomed it. Labour MEPs.
Yeah, because we voted for it, so that's called honesty. And that's what all the main groups did. In the end, they voted for it. So, and that's the honest position. So,
you said at the EU Summit on Migration in June 2018, quote, "It is key that the Council comes up with comprehensive, humanitarian and effective solutions to migration at this meeting. The European Parliament has done its work on co-legislator by putting forward its position on Dublin with the reform of the common European asylum system. The solution for an EU approach based on solidarity and shared responsibility is on the table, and the Council needs to act now. And if it is not possible to take a decision by unanimity, it is time to decide by majority."
Yes, yeah.
Didn't this path to reforming the asylum system and the Dublin regulation start just a long time ago in 2015, right? Why is it still in discussion and it was not approved?
Because the member states don't want it. They made it unanimity, which was their big sledgehammer. So I have pushed majority voting continually. So thank you for praising me for my lone battle in the council. That's what I've been doing. Thank you very much.
And in 2015,
and if it was majority voting, we would now have an asylum package, because there are many member states who are affected. France, Malta, others who would all vote for it. But they would be in the majority. But we needed unanimity, so that Portugal, all countries that have enough sense to go for the asylum package.
And do you feel like that will be done by the end of the mandate?
Majority voting, we would have had an asylum package. I'd be talking to you now about refinements to our asylum package. You'd be talking about, are there enough legal routes? But instead we've got the member states strangling what's going on. I mean, I had a blue card immigration proposal, which can't even be voted in its first reading here because it's got the word migration in it, and you have got a new phase of like a sledgehammer here, with member states not being running scared of populists, and the complete inertia. But do
you expect this Dublin regulation and the new asylum? Do you expect that to be put in place by the end of the mandate?
No, because I think populism has driven the member states in this direction. They've not destroyed it; they've frozen it, which at least is something. But I don't have high hopes of the next European Parliament political makeup. I think it will be more right wing. It'll be more right wing. The left will become, in response, will become probably a little bit more ideological and exhibitionist. It'll want more of its slogans. So unfortunately, what will happen is they'll play around with people's lives in the end, because it's actually people, And what was needed was the package to save lives, to get more legal routes. We're talking about Europe. We're talking about a country within living, a state, a place within living memory that had colonies, yeah? You'll know that. You're from Portugal, had many. So we're talking about a construct that needs a practical policy right now, because people are dying right now. And so I worked hard for this majority, but it would have been a good way to get through it. Many member states wanted it, but we're in the stranglehold now. The problem with the stranglehold is now has big countries involved in it too. I would say, like in the council, Portugal is a country that is on the really progressive end, but they're not getting a voice at the moment because of this stranglehold. So I think it will be frozen. You're going to have a worse European Parliament next time. And I think that's going to weaken things. But the optimism is that we still have democracy, and we have people like you, we have people who will care, and that will keep the light shining, and eventually people will realise that we need immigration in Europe. Refugees need to come, we don't take the most, and eventually we'll claw back from this position.
Is this your last mandate at the EP?
I don't know yet. Do you want a discussion about Brexit?
I don't know. We have 3 minutes.
I think we don't have time because I think you're somewhat overloaded. I think you're doing very well, and you've asked the correct, difficult questions on migration. But if you want Brexit, I'm very happy to do that.
No, we don't
as
have
well.
time. But do you feel like it's...
Can I tell you something? Brexit's also about the other. It's also about populism. It's also
Is
about
it also
immigration.
about migration?
Brexit is the new immigration. Yes, of course it is. It's about the other. It's about free movement. It's about migration. It's the conflation of those things. And people outside the UK need to know that if they don't know it already. And any journalist who doesn't understand it needs to know that that's what it's about. It's about the other. It's about immigrants. It's about refugees. It's about the Portuguese in London. It's about what happened in 2004. It's about how the British press exploited that. The conflation between the EU and immigration, and the denigration of the EU as an institution by the right-wing press in the UK. This is what created Brexit. But if I had longer, I'd give you a more complicated answer, but I think that's it in a nutshell.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Este foi mais um episódio do É Apenas Fumaça, um programa Fumaça onde se fala sobre a sociedade com quem quer falar sobre ela. Obrigado, Claude Moraes, eurodeputado britânico. Esta entrevista foi preparada por mim, Ricardo Esteves Ribeiro. O Bernardo Afonso fez a edição de som. Fazem da parte da equipa Fumaça Ana Freitas, Frederico Raposo, Margarida David Cardoso, Maria Almeida, Mão Tafes, Pedro Miguel Santos, Sofia Rocha, Tomás Pereira e Tomás Pinho. A música é dos Lotus Fever. Ouçam mais episódios em fumaca.pt, no YouTube, Spotify ou na tua aplicação de podcasts. Até já.